Joining us for this discussion from Taipei in Taiwan is Ross Feingold, a political analyst who also serves as director of the Association of Americans Resident Overseas. From Beijing, joining us is Victor Gao, vice president of the Beijing-based Centre for China and Globalisation. And rounding out our panel here on Counterpoints from London is Bill Hayton, associate fellow with the Asia-Pacific programme at Chatham House and author of The Invention of China. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us here on Counterpoints. It's a pleasure to have you all here. And if you look at the activities of several of China's Indo-Pacific neighbours, they appear to be preparing for some sort of escalation. For example, the Philippines has recently signed a defence pact with Canada to boost its standing and its defences in the South China Sea. So, Victor, I'm going to go straight to you first. Is China preparing to take Taiwan by force?
Taiwan is part of China. There is only one China, as declared by the Declaration of Cairo, as well as dictated by the Potsdam Proclamation. These two documents form the pillars upon which the international order was based upon after the defeat of Nazi Germany in Europe and the Japanese fascism in the Asian Pacific region. So the whole world recognizes this policy. And there is no country in the world which can recognize both China and Taiwan at the same time. And we need to be fully aware of this. By defending this one China policy, we are defending the international order established back in 1945.
Ross, you're in Taiwan. How do you interpret what Victor has said?
Well, even if what Victor said is true, there's still a reality that we all have to deal with, and policymakers around the region and around the world who consider themselves stakeholders in this issue. And there's no denying that other countries further afield feel that they are stakeholders. So even if China says it's an internal affair, obviously other countries, not just the United States, but increasingly European countries, Australia, more recently Japan, they consider themselves stakeholders as well. And the reality is that since the end of the Chinese Civil War in 1949, Taiwan and China have been separately governed. That's just a fact. They are separately governed. And the only way to bring about unification would be either a peaceful way or by force. And at the moment, China's position is very clear that they reserve the right to use force. And that's why we see other countries, including here in Taiwan, they're responding to that with their own military moves. Again, that's just a reality. It's not a biased position that I'm stating. I'm just stating the facts that the two sides have been separately governed. And the people are preparing for the possibility that China will use force.
Victor, I'm going to bring you in a moment, Bill, but I just want to get a quick response to you from that, Victor, particularly on that. Unification is either peacefully or by force, because even though you say that it is one China, a lot of countries, particularly the US, do not support a unilateral change to the status quo, which is, as Ross said, they are governed separately. So any change to that status quo, is it going to be peaceful or is it going to be by force?
First of all, we all know there was a civil war towards the end of the 1940s. Allow me to emphasize that civil war was never brought to an official end by any means. That is the reality of the separation across the two sides of the Taiwan Strait. Now, if China ever uses force, it will not be an invasion. It will be a resurrection of the unfinished civil war. And we want to avoid that. We want to achieve unification by peaceful means. But if, for example, as Ross said, other countries want to be stakeholders, to be intervening in this situation, there will be the resurrection of the unfinished civil war. And I don't think any country in the world, including the United States, wants to shed the blood of their soldiers to be involved in a resurrected civil war across the two sides of the Taiwan Strait. Let's all work together to achieve the peaceful reunification that all of us want, and let's do our best to avoid the resurrection of the unfinished civil war.
Bill, what do you make of that? If we are going to see a show of force, is it, as Victor says, a resurrection of an unfinished civil war, or is it an act of aggression?
Well, that's obviously the Chinese narrative, is that it's the unfinished part of the Civil War. I mean, the other way of looking at it, it extends from what Ross was saying, which is that in the last 130 years, China has only ruled Taiwan for 4 of those, for 4 years between 1945 and 1949. And you have a very different sense of self, if you like, in Taiwan. You ask people, do they feel Chinese? Among the younger generation, it's a tiny, tiny proportion who say they feel exclusively Chinese. But really what the outside world wants is the status quo. What they're worried about is a change of the situation by force, whether that's an actual invasion or some kind of blockade by China. And if that, if there was any change to the status quo, I think it would unleash a whole series of really dangerous dominoes. I think Japan would try to develop nuclear weapons, and it probably has the skills to do so within months. That would probably trigger South Korea to develop nuclear weapons. We'd have all kinds of unforeseen consequences from China taking unilateral action over the status of Taiwan.
Ross, can you see the unilateral movement from China to reunify with Taiwan, creating that sort of a dangerous ripple effect? Is that something you sense being in Taipei?
Well, whether or not there's a regional arms race, I think, frankly, we're already there. We see that with commitments by Japan and South Korea for significant increases in defense spending. Now, part of that's in response to North Korea. Part of it's in response, frankly, to China. The Philippines is also dramatically increasing its defense budgets after decades of underinvestment. And here in Taiwan, there's a new proposal for a nearly $40 billion supplemental defense budget, which is an enormous amount of money. So I think the key question is not really what would happen if and when China should use force, or would that set off military spending increases? Because again, I think we're already there. Really, the key question, and I think my colleagues know this, the key question is, should China use force? Would other countries militarily intervene? And that's what caused the controversy after Prime Minister Takachi's remarks about 3 weeks ago in the Japanese parliament. And really, in response to what Victor said about foreign leaders, foreign countries being willing to shed blood, the only thing we could really say about that question is it will be up to the leaders of those countries at the time that this contingency occurs. There's simply no way to predict whether or not the U.S. president or the Japan prime minister or the Australian prime minister, at the time that such an event occurs, would they be willing to dispatch their military and engage in what would be a hot war with China?
Victor, what do you make of that? I mean, jump in, please, if you feel you want to respond to this idea of can you imagine a nuclear-armed Japan and South Korea in response to China's actions in Taiwan? That's a big risk for China to take, is it not?
Allow me to mention, I'm shocked to hear some of the remarks from the other co-panelists. They talk about Japan as if Japan is in the same line with China. No. If you read the United Nations Charter, there is a particular clause called enemy state, and Japan is an enemy state as far as that clause is concerned. Meaning the Japanese government are prohibited from possessing combative weapons of aggression to constitute another threat to the victor nations, including China. And if, for example, Japan wants to rearm and to constitute another threat to the victor nations, including China, the United Nations Charter authorizes the victor nations to take unilateral military actions against Japan without the need to consult and inform the United Nations Security Council beforehand. That means if you look at China and Japan, they are not equal. One is the country which unconditionally surrendered in 1945. The other country, China is a victor nation, together with other allied countries like the United States. So never talk to me about Japan developing nuclear weapons. If they do that, that will be the moment of their annihilation, because they will constitute threat to China, and China has all the power and the authorization to destroy that new menace from Japan. China will never allow Japan to become another militaristic or fascist country because of the prohibition of the United Nations Charter. And that is part of the condition upon which Japan unconditionally surrendered. And no one should even think about Japan raising its head of fascism again to threaten China.
Bill, do you want to jump in?
I think that's a really good reason for why the status quo should be preserved. I mean, if you don't want to unravel the post-war security order in East Asia, then preserve the current status of Taiwan and carry on with business as usual. I think that Victor has made a very strong case there for preventing a whole series of unforeseen consequences from China attempting to change the status quo over Taiwan.
Allow me to add a point. I think to preserve the legacy of the Second World War is to make sure China is a united country. And no one should indulge in the fantasy that China should ever be separated across the two sides of the Taiwan Strait. Meaning, to achieve national unity for China is a precondition of preserving the victory legacy of the Second World War. If you argue with me otherwise, you either don't read history or you are misguided by your misperception of the realities of the world. If any one country wants to fight militarily against China to prevent China's reunification, he or she will be doomed to failure. If you ever want to try that, then you are really playing peril for yourself.
Could I ask a question of Victor?
Yeah,
Victor, do you think
the United Nations enemy state clause, many experts do consider that obsolete, and even China voted for a resolution affirming that it was obsolete, and that vote was in the 1990s. So whether or not it still applies is actually it's kind of an unresolved legal question at the moment. But I do think that the likelihood of Japan developing nuclear weapons in the near term is highly unlikely. However, the reality is that Japan is significantly increasing its defense budget. They've been doing so ever since Abe came back as prime minister in 2012, and that's continued under Abe's successors since 2020. They've changed their prime minister multiple times, but it's clear that the trajectory is for increased spending, not just by Japan, but again, as I said, by other countries in the region. So we are in an arms race here in Asia.
Bill, you wanted to ask a question of Victor?
Lawyer, please allow me to mention something obsolete without being terminated still is not terminated. Therefore, allow me to emphasize for your benefit, as well as the benefit of our audience, that the United Nations Charter Enemy Clause remains on the book, and it can be triggered if Japan wants to move in the wrong direction of rearmament and remilitarization to such an extent that it constitutes a threat to China. China will go to war with Japan if Japan wants to rearm itself, as well as even possessing the nuclear weapon, because that is the right authorized by the victor nations as reflected in the enemy clause in the United Nations Charter. Don't be misguided about the so-called obsolete of that clause. That clause remains on the book. I've checked with the Security Council office just recently, and they reaffirmed the validity of that enemy clause. So don't play with fire. If you advise Japan, ask them to read very carefully.
Bill, you wanted to ask a question of Victor. Go ahead. But I also want to ask you, Bill, does Victor have a point here?
Well, it does. I mean, we're all kind of getting a bit hypothetical here. I mean, my question, my comments about, the next stage all followed from, a forcible change of the status quo over Taiwan. And so in saying that if the status quo does change, then I think, it will trigger a whole load of other moves, by the regional powers, by Japan, by South Korea, and, presumably, wider than that as well. But I do think there's an interesting question here. I mean, given that it's, so long since, China, the mainland, actually ruled Taiwan, I just wonder, asking Victor, hypothetically, do you think that the Irish are a different group of people, a different nation to the British, Victor?
You are completely wrong. The better comparison is the United Nations versus the Confederation. There was only one country, that is the United States of America. The Confederation wants to break away from the Union. And if you test the opinion at that time, probably up to 100% of the people in the Confederation wanted to break away from the Union. Why President Lincoln was ranked as one of the greatest presidents of the United States? He refused to accept that. He wants to use force to bring back the Confederation into the Union. Therefore, as you can see, President Lincoln and the Federation won. The Confederation was defeated. They were brought back into the Union by force, by defeating the Confederation. This is a better comparison for the two sides of the Taiwan Strait. China will never allow breakaway of Taiwan because if you read the Potsdam Proclamation and the Cairo Declaration, Taiwan in its entirety should be returned to China upon the unconditional surrender of Japan. And it was returned. Now, there was a civil war afterwards, but there was only one China. China being separated across the two sides of the Taiwan Strait. That is a fact. But there is only one China. And if Taiwan wants to break away from China, China will need to bring them back into China by force, as President Lincoln did vis-a-vis the Confederation. That is not aggression. That is not using force against another country. That is civil war, as the civil war in the United States. Thereafter, the United States has always been one country under God, indivisible. China should always be indivisible after the reunification of Taiwan.
Yeah, but I think if we went back 120 years when Ireland was part of the United Kingdom, and we can see that things change. And if people decide that they are a nation and that they deserve self-determination, well, why shouldn't they have self-determination?
Allow me to emphasize, what the British or the English or the Irish want to do, it's their business. What the Chinese want to do here on the two sides of the Taiwan Strait, it is our business. As I declared just now, there is only one China. If you go back to Ireland and ask your government whether they recognize two China or one China, one Taiwan, you will be informed that they recognize only one China. They recognize that Taiwan is part of China, and China has full authorization as a sovereign country to deal with a part of its territory which wants to break away. And the better principle you need to keep in your mind is what President Lincoln did with the Confederation. Whatever Lincoln did to the Confederation, China has the right to do the same for the so-called breakaway Taiwan province.
That brings me to something I want to bring you in here on, Ross, because Victor says, what happens is up to China, but it's also up to what Taiwan wants as well. And we're seeing China carrying out bigger, bolder military drills closer to Taiwan. It's enacting this kind of anaconda strategy of sort of strangling the island. Is that emboldening people in Taiwan to want to resist China? Or is it making them more submissive, realizing they cannot outfight the might of China?
Well, for many people, it's probably somewhere in the middle, consistent with what Victor has said. People here know that a unilateral declaration of independence, if, for example, the government and the people had a consensus that they were going to change the name from Republic of China to the Republic of Taiwan. And this is what people typically call formal independence. I think people here know that the most likely outcome of that would be an immediate Chinese attack. At the same time, the number of people here who are saying we want to reunify with China on China's terms, which is similar to what China offered or implemented in Hong Kong and Macau, one country, two systems. The number of people here who support that as a short-term occurrence is very small, which means most people here, for now, prefer the status quo. But there is an interesting aspect to this, and it does go to your question. They do have elections here. And over the past nearly 30 years of democratic elections, the electorate has switched back and forth a few times. They've elected more independence-minded leaders, and they've also elected leaders who preferred a closer relationship with China and adamantly opposed Taiwan independence and emphatically believe that Taiwan is part of one China. And the voters elected a leader like that two times in recent decades, in 2008 and 2012. But in 2016 and 2020, the voters emphatically elected a more independence-minded leader. And in 2024, it was a really strange result because the independence-minded leader was elected with only 40% of the vote because the other 60% was split between two candidates who were more moderate when it came to dealing with China. So it actually shows that, at least at the moment, the majority seems to be just wanting some moderation. They don't want to go for independence because they're concerned about a immediate Chinese use of force. But they don't want to unify either. It seems that now they want to get along with China. I think at the moment, one could say that the public is a little concerned with some of the moves that the government has made that may have inflamed tensions. There are many people who support the government wholeheartedly, but it does seem at the moment that there's a trend to say, well, maybe we need to get along better with China.
When we talk about getting along with China, I guess that turns us to the United States. One of Taiwan's key friendships, I should say, an unofficial friendship and interesting relationship with China recently. Taiwan is a key US partner, though, in the Indo-Pacific. The US obviously doesn't officially recognise its sovereignty, but it does oppose unilateral changes to the status quo from either side, I should note, going to what you said there, Ross. Earlier this year, though, the White House reportedly discouraged Taiwan's leader from visiting the US over the summer so as not to anger China. This was all happening during the trade wars between Washington and Beijing. So, Bill, that begs the question for many people. Would President Trump compromise Taiwan's territorial integrity, Taiwan's status quo, in order to maintain his relationship with China?
I think, unfortunately, the bad answer to that is only President Trump knows that. But it might be different today than it is tomorrow. But I think in terms of US posture over the last half century or more, they've always seen the status quo as integral to the American position in Asia. And I think from a defense and security perspective, maintaining Taiwan's self-rule is absolutely critical to US national security at a global sense. That said, of course, President Trump has been consistent on two things throughout his career. One is he absolutely hates, what he thinks of as unfair trade, and he blames China for that. But the other one is he absolutely hates foreign wars. So whether he would actually be willing to go to war is a moot point, I think. And whether he thinks he could do some kind of deal that would somehow avoid China getting into a war with China and, getting some kind of good trade deal as he sees it from China, and that Taiwan ends up being the sort of, the collateral damage to that deal. I don't think we can confidently say yes or no, but I think it needs to be factored into any kind of consideration of this three-way relationship between China, the US, and the leadership in Taiwan.
Ross, how do you see that? Is Taiwan a bit of a pawn here in President Trump's game in relationship with China? Does Taiwan think that it's secure under President Trump?
Whether or not Taiwan's a pawn is a topic of endless conversation among talking heads like me here in Taiwan, among government officials, politicians, legislators arguing back and forth about this topic. We do know that the administration, the Trump administration, does include a number of people who are very strong supporters of Taiwan, starting with Secretary of State, National Security Advisor Rubio. So I think it's a safe assumption that he often counsels the president to show support for Taiwan, including things like letting William Lai transit the United States. Given the precedent that exists for these kinds of transit stops, there's literally decades of precedent. It happens once a year, typically. But ultimately, the decision maker is President Trump. That being said, I mentioned earlier this proposed defense supplemental budget of nearly $40 billion US. I do think that President Trump is inclined to approve large weapons sales to Taiwan. If Taiwan is willing to make the money available, then I think the administration will sell a significant amount of new weapons or additional weapons for systems it has already sold. For example, more Patriot missile batteries, and that there's precedent because the U.S. has already sold Patriots to Taiwan. And I think President Trump would simply tell that we've always sold weapons to Taiwan. You know that. We've not given up our sovereign right to sell weapons to Taiwan. And, to put it more simply, speaking as an American, Americans always support a fair fight. So if this is going to be a war, even if America is not going to send its troops to fight and die, I think America would continue to make weapons available to Taiwan.
What do you think about those weapons being available, Victor? Does that pose an issue for China?
Allow me to make one perspective. We talk about U.S.-Taiwan relations as if, they started from yesterday. No. When Dr. Henry Kissinger made the secret visit to China in 1971, when President Nixon made the state visit to China in 1972, the United States had diplomatic relations with the Republic of China in Taiwan. And the United States and Taiwan, or the Republic of China, had a defense treaty. And the United States stationed tens of thousands of military troops in Taiwan. In order to normalize relations with the People's Republic of China, the United States broke off all these points. They decided to withdraw all the U.S. troops stationed in Taiwan back out of Taiwan. They broke off diplomatic recognition with Taiwan. They even rescinded the U.S. ROC Defense Treaty, which was a domestic law in the United States. They did all the impossibilities in order to do what? To normalize relations with the People's Republic of China. Now, yes, of course, the United States is still supplying weapons to Taiwan, but do you know where will be these weapons after the reunification? Most of these weapons, if not destroyed, will be on display in a military museum, either somewhere in Taiwan or in mainland China. Therefore, if you think that the weapons supplied to Taiwan by the United States will enable the separatists in Taiwan to defeat China, you are indulging in fantasy. The United States publicly acknowledges in terms of a conventional weapon, the Chinese conventional weapons are not inferior to the United States. They are actually, in many cases, already superior to the US weapons. In terms of other weapons, China's weapons are ahead of the United States. For example, President Trump is talking about F-47, for example, the sixth generation of the Phantom stealth planes. China is already producing two types of that from two manufacturers, one in Chengdu, the other one in Shenyang. And if the United States does not have the supply of rare earth from China, their defense industry will grind down to a halt. So don't think if you think about the war between China and the United States will win the war. What if they don't? What if they lose the war? Especially in the war close to the Chinese coastline, and every inch of land in Taiwan is fully covered by the long-range artillery pieces in Fujian, in Guangdong, and in Zhejiang. So you are talking about a completely one-sided war if the war ever breaks out. Let's all use our sanity to propose peace rather than agitating for war. The war will be quick. It will be very, very swift, and the result will not be surprising at all. And if you are betting on the wrong side of the equation, what if you are on the wrong side? What if you are on the losing side? That is the moment of truth. We all need to think about it. And China will never take any military action unless it is fully believed, fully convinced it is on the right side of history.
Okay.
What will make China to reach that conviction? To achieve national unity is always the right thing for China to do. And to defend and preserve the victory legacy of the Second World War after defeating Japanese fascism is always the right thing to do. If you're a British or an Australian, don't forget all the atrocities and the crimes against humanity, against your nationals, and humanity as a whole committed by the Japanese fascism in the Second World War.
We're going to come back to Japan in just a moment, but I want to bring our other two guests back in. Ross, it doesn't sound like China's not thinking about war.
Certainly, China is preparing for war. The increase in defense spending in recent decades has been tremendous, as has the increase in the capabilities of the branches of China's military. Victor's correct about that. China's technological capability, their ability to combine arms across the different services, whether that's air, naval, or land forces, or their rocket forces, and increasingly cyber and space, is commensurate with how we generally perceive China's rapid growth in its technological capabilities in recent decades. Certainly, if there is a war and the United States and its allies, whether that's Japan or Australia, decide to join, thousands of soldiers and sailors and airmen from every country involved in this conflict will certainly die. This will be not just a drone war. People increasingly talk about drone wars, but this will be fought in large part on the sea or in the Taiwan Strait, possibly on land in Taiwan as well if China successfully makes a landing. And again, civilians will die, soldiers will die, and it'll be a horrible, horrible conflict. That's not, those possibilities, which do exist, they're very real, that's still not going to stop the United States from selling weapons to Taiwan or stop Taiwan from increasing its defense budget. Those are just realities that are going to happen.
Bill, you're shaking your head there. Do you agree? I mean, whether or not the US might step in and intervene, certainly not blinking an eye at supplying Taiwan with some of its most cutting-edge defences.
Yeah, I think the thinking from countries that are broadly supportive of the status quo is that they want to make war unthinkable. And if the more that they can bolster Taiwan's defences and therefore make an invasion either a failure or too costly, for the People's Republic of China, then that's a way of preserving the status quo. So the more advanced weaponry that Taiwan has, the greater the drone numbers of drones, etc., will deter China. And this is really, I think, getting to this, idea, going back to Cold War deterrence here. It's really about, what can I do to inflict damage on you that will stop you doing something that I don't like? It's pretty bare-knuckle stuff, really. And when you hear Victor using this 1930s language about, invasions and acquiring, using force against neighbors and all the rest of it, then, it kind of just brings home, the urgency, I think, that people, that countries, that leaderships feel about the necessity of maintaining the status quo in East Asia.
Victor, President Joe Biden explicitly pledged several times during his term in office to come to Taiwan's defence if war erupted. Do you think that Taiwan can equally rely on President Trump? Do you think that he is as willing and determined to step in as his predecessor was? Because even though you were saying that the US should be worried, Joe Biden wasn't worried. He said we're going to be there. Maybe President Trump's going to say the same.
Thank you. Each time President Biden made such remarks, he was corrected by his Department of State as well as Department of Defense at that time, now called Department of War, fortunately. That means there is still sanity in Washington, even during the presidency of President Biden. And for the validity of the points made by President Biden, you just need to listen to what President Trump is saying. He says he's an autopan. He does not have brain operating in the normal way. I do not want to be involved in comments like that. But allow me to say, whether the US president decides to be involved or not, the United States will not win that combat if it ever happens across the two sides of the Taiwan Strait. Therefore, to think about providing more weapons to Taiwan so they can deter China's reunification is indulging in fantasy. That sounds to me as a recipe for ripping off Taiwan by charging them billions of dollars by selling arms, which will not turn out to be effective at all. Why? Why do I say this? If you assume there will be a war between China and the United States, does the United States have full confidence it will win the war? No, there is no such confidence in Washington that if war breaks out between China and the United States, even a total war, the United States will always have 100% assuredness of their winning the war. Therefore, why do you want to believe that Taiwan, which is part of China, and the United States fully recognizes this one China policy, wants to supply weapons, and they will believe that Taiwan, with these weapons, will be able to hold off China if China wants to exercise its legitimate right of achieving national unity? Come on, you are not being that unsophisticated, I hope. Therefore, all the talks about sending more weapons to Taiwan seems to me is a sure recipe of ripping off Taiwan, try to get some more money out of that. And now you are talking about 50 billion US dollars. You will even charge them 500 billion US dollars, and they will still not be able to hold off the almightiness of the Chinese nation if we decide to make sure that national unity will be achieved at any cost. This is the noblest thing for the Chinese nation to achieve in our lifetime.
Ross, is the US just trying to rip off Taiwan, getting some more money by selling it weapons that it can't use and won't need?
That's a question that's also a matter of frequent public discussion here. There are literally tens of billions of dollars of past U.S. weapon sales that have not been delivered. The Trump administration in its first term sold Taiwan 66 F-16 aircraft, for example. That sale was announced in 2019. The contracts were signed in 2020. The aircraft were supposed to be delivered by now, and they still haven't been delivered. And now there's talk about, well, maybe next year some of them will be delivered, but not all of them will be delivered next year. So it certainly is a source of frustration here, and it does give opponents to the defense spending a pretty potent talking point to say these weapons are expensive, and we thought the U.S. was our friend, but then we spent the money and the goods didn't arrive. The goods got prioritized for Ukraine, for example, or there was COVID and all these excuses about delays in the supply chain. So yes, people here do talk about that topic. We also have to keep in mind that the opposition parties do control the legislature. So whether or not Lai's proposed $39.85 billion supplemental defense budget will easily pass through Taiwan's parliament, that is actually unknown at the moment. He only announced this last week. It's still very early days. The opposition will be under tremendous pressure. Victor, you might not like it, but the reality is the opposition will be under pressure from the United States to pass this budget. And maybe the opposition will say, well, we'll approve some of it, but not all, or we want milestones before we release additional tranches of funding. But again, I do think it will pass in some form, and the U.S. will make available additional weapons.
I want to circle us back to Japan for our final segment here, because Japan's Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi has sparked a related row with China. She told Parliament that a Japanese attack on Taiwan would also threaten Japan and therefore could trigger Japanese military action. I know we've discussed it in various points earlier in this debate, but I want to focus on it just in this last segment. Bill, I want to ask you, is there any justification to Japan's concerns here that an attack on Taiwan also threatens Japan's national security?
Well, it completely upends Japan's security position in East Asia. At the moment, all of the islands that are off China's coast are, in effect, controlled by governments who have a friendly relationship with the US and are skeptical, let's say, of China. Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, etc. And if that changes, then of course it's going to fundamentally change Japan's strategic position. That's just a fact of geopolitics, geostrategy. So therefore, it is going to critically affect, Japan's security posture. And also, as a supplement, any war that involves, around Taiwan that starts to involve United States forces, well, a lot of those forces are based in Japan. There may be attacks on American forces in Japan, for example. So again, that would necessarily impact, Japanese security. So I think what she was saying, although it was, absolutely, red rag to China's bull here, was basically, she was just saying the quiet part out loud. Everybody knows this, but you're just not supposed to say it in public.
What do you think about that, Victor? I mean, security postures change, geopolitics develops, alliances, friends, foe, that all changes with time. Why isn't Japan allowed to update and modernize its security posture?
First of all, Prime Minister Takaichi's very outrageous remark is a very dangerous indication of new Japanese fascism and new Japanese militarism. Why? Because ever after Japan's unconditional surrender in 1945, this was the first time a sitting Japanese prime minister threatened use of war against another country. And that country turned out to be China. Now, Japan is strictly, legally prohibited to constitute another threat to China by law, by the terms of its unconditional surrender. We should not forget that. We should always keep that in mind. The terms of the unconditional surrender of Japan to China.
But Japan wouldn't be the first country to change that. That was a long time ago. And what's been written in the UN doesn't necessarily is always adhered to.
No, it's not a long time ago. Japan caused the loss of life, 35 million lives in China. China will never forget the atrocities and the crimes against humanity they committed in China. And the burdens placed upon Japan by the unconditional surrender instrument have no time limit. Japan is always required to be a peaceful nation rather than a militaristic nation. And I told my American friends, remember Pearl Harbor. If Japan can betray its commitments it undertook as far as its unconditional surrender to China is concerned, they can easily betray the commitments they entered into vis-a-vis the United States. And then you need to prepare for another attack on Pearl Harbor or anywhere else. Therefore, to make sure that Japan remains a pacifist country is an utmost important thing in this part of the world, and no country, no individual, including our two distinguished panelists here, together, we are sharing this panel, should ever allow the danger of new Japanese militarism or new Japanese fascism to raise its dangerous head, it will be quashed before it can be raised against China.
Ross, is Japan more of a threat in the region than China is?
Japan's security concern, first and foremost, is to defend the Japanese homeland. Frankly, I was a little critical of the reaction here in Taiwan to Prime Minister Takaichi's remarks because there were many people here who took it as a commitment to come to fight for Taiwan, which is not really what she said. The most basic essence of what she said was, if there is a conflict between China and Taiwan, it is, of course, a security risk to Japan. And that's true, as Bill pointed out. And they would be on alert. They would be watching. They may have to evacuate Japanese nationals from Taiwan if there's a war, and they would be using their military resources, understandably, to do that. But she didn't specifically say that Japan will come to Taiwan's military assistance in the event of a conflict. But unfortunately, I think a lot of people here in Taiwan reacted that way. And there were Taiwan politicians putting photos on social media of themselves eating Japanese seafood and saying, oh, we should all go visit Japan because Chinese tourists aren't going to Japan. I thought that was a bit of a silly overreaction here in Taiwan. But as far as how the rest of the region views Japan's increased military spending in recent years and going forward, China is certainly critical of that, but we really don't see or hear a critical voice from other countries in the region. We don't see the ASEAN countries criticizing Japan's increase in defense spending, nor do we hear those countries criticizing Australia's increase in defense spending, or even the United States' increased interest in deployments in this part of the world as well. So to answer your question, no, we don't hear that message coming from ASEAN countries, for example.
Allow me to make a point. Yes. Before the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, not many people in the United States were critical of what the Japanese government was doing at the time. But then Pearl Harbor happened. So the fact that not many people are critical of what Japan is doing doesn't mean that they are doing the right thing. You need to put it in historical perspective. You need to realize that the current international order we are living in through was more or less started in 1945 upon the unconditional surrender of Japan. That is the pillar. That is the Big Bang event. And we are all living in the overshadow of that Big Bang event. Now, if you want to change it, if you really want to allow the rearmament of Japan and the remilitarization of Japan, even if you are not fully aware of the consequences, you may one day be surprised. Look how many Australian soldiers were butchered by the Japanese military. Look at how many British prisoners of war were killed. Look at the long march of death. And look at all the atrocities they committed in the Philippines, in the ASEAN nations, in all the Pacific islands against the Americans, for example. And do you think President Roosevelt said the wrong thing when he said Japan was the country of infamy? Today was the day of infamy, and the Americans will never allow another Pearl Harbor. Why? Because you should never think about the possibility of Japan betraying its commitments it entered when it unconditionally surrendered to raise its dangerous militaristic head in this part of the world. Because allow me to warn you, that moment will be a moment of destruction. That moment will herald in war, and that moment will also herald in the annihilation of Japan as a country, because they betrayed their commitments, they want to rearm, they want to reconstitute another threat to a country like China, and they will forfeit their right to live as a peaceful nation, as they committed to when they unconditionally surrendered to China in 1945.
All right, let me just get a final response from Bill on that. What do you think? I mean, their unconditional surrender. Times have changed. Are countries not allowed to adapt to the changing environment, or is Japan too much of a risk?
Well, I think Victor's bellicose, warlike language is an amazing revelation, really. I mean, I don't think anybody in the region is convinced by his portrayal of Japan, but they're increasingly worried about China's posture. It's China is the country that's the one that's threatening to go to war. Japan isn't. You know, as we were hearing, you know, ASEAN, Southeast Asian countries, other countries haven't raised concerns about what Japan's doing, but they are mightily concerned about what China is doing. And Victor's language today is the language of the 1930s, war, taking territory, you know, fighting people. I don't think it convinces the region. I don't think it convinces the region of China's case. I think it convinces the region that China is the problem here. And I think, you know, that's increasingly the situation that we're heading into in the next few years.